Krampus. We're here to talk about Krampus and the strange folklore of Christmas. And although this is a slightly fuzzy picture, the reason that I picked this particular one is because it's really quite representative of Krampus. There he is. He's got his chains, one of the most important aspects of Krampus. He's got a very long and sinister tongue. He's got his goat-like horns, and he's stuffing children into a basket and terrifying them. Who is this figure? Why is he doing these things? Well, we will dig into all. To start us off, though, just to introduce myself, my name is Martin Vaux. I am one of the co-hosts of the Three Ravens podcast. We are a podcast that talks all about mythology and folklore. We talk about the history of the 39 counties of England, but also all aspects of folk culture. Recently, we reached number 11 in the top fiction podcasts on Spotify. And today, at the time of recording, we are at number 10 in the Apple and iTunes rankings for UK fiction podcasts, which is a huge thing for us because Eleanor and I, Eleanor being my lovely, much better half, we run the podcast from our workroom upstairs, where we do things like sewing and crafting, and started it about 18 months, 20 months ago, perhaps. And in that time, people have got really into Three Ravens. So we are chuffed to bits about the success the podcast has had. And obviously here we are, ready for Christmas. I hope you appreciate not only that I'm getting into the Christmas spirit, but also that I have my Legends Chasers t-shirt on from my last presentation that I gave, which was all about dragons. Today, though, we are talking about Krampus. And whenever I'm faced with a question or a problem like, Krampus, how do we talk about him? I tend to think, well, let's go back to the beginning. And we know that Krampus is an important Christmas spirit, but we've got a question. Where did Christmas even come from? And you might say to me, Martin, that's an obvious question. We all know where Christmas came from. Christmas came from the baby Jesus, right? The arrival of Jesus, the nativity story. This is a lovely painting from the 13th century demonstrating a kind of medieval or early Renaissance concept of the nativity story. I'll blow it up and make it even larger. Here we have, of course, the wise men or three kings there coming and bowing before the infant Christ. We've got animals in the background, of course, all being made tame by the appearance of the Son of God, who we learn in the Christmas story is God and the Son of God and the Holy Spirit, all three in one, which must have felt very confusing for him. But it's okay. He's wise. You can see he's even radiating holiness at that point in time. And then behind these initial characters, we've got an absolute bedlam of people who are all coming to see baby Jesus. Wonderful. Christmas must be famous. Everybody must know the Christmas story. Well, what does Bede have to say? And you might say to me, who's Bede and what's he got to do with the price of fish? Well, Bede was an 8th century monk, and he is known as the father of history. Okay? Before Bede, we in Europe, since the fall of the Roman Empire, have been in something that people used to call the Dark Ages. Why did they call it the Dark Ages? Well, because culture kind of went dark. We don't have a lot of writing from this span of time of between sort of 600 and 500, 600 years, roughly. A beautiful art, a few little bits of writing in runes from some places, but Bede, this monk, he's sort of the first person who sets about trying to write down the history of anything. And his particular focus, well, it's quite complicated. He writes three, I mean, they're almost four, but we can call them three really key texts. He starts off with something called On the Nature of Things and On Times. He does that as quite a young man, and he starts writing about how he thinks the universe came into existence. So it's a big project, but he does it in quite a short essay. He then follows this up several years later with The Reckoning of Time, which is a much longer work. And then his masterpiece, the thing that most people remember him for, is the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. And in all of these texts, he not only tries to account for all of the events of history, really, of the Earth, its creation, how the planets work, all that kind of really big stuff, but he also sets about trying to detail really specific things about how Christianity particularly works in England, and also all of the main Christian festivals that are celebrated. And he compares the Christian festivals that existed in the 8th century with older examples from previous Anglo-Saxon powers, but also various other kinds of pagan tribal celebration. And bit of a shocker. His big focus in the Reckoning of Time and the ecclesiastical history of the English people is Easter, because Easter is the big show for Christians at this point in time. It's the miraculous bit, right? Jesus coming back from the dead, dying for everyone's sins. That's the big story. And the promise of heaven and this kind of paradise afterlife is one of the big innovations of Christianity. Before that comes along, really, that isn't available as a religious option to people. And Bede is quite worried about how Passover and how the Jewish peoples celebrated Passover and Easter and how Christians at his time are celebrating that particular festival. He's a bit worried they're too similar, and he's talking about how they need to be made different, as well as talking about all sorts of different bun fights that there have been inside the church up to that point in time. Big shocker, though, everyone. Brace yourselves. Because although Easter is the big one, here we are, the Passion being broken down into beautiful Renaissance art, absolutely stunning. Crucifixion, the key symbol, obviously, of Christianity. The big shocker, though, is that, as far as Bede's concerned, Christmas does not exist. So from the 8th century, we don't have Christmas when Bede is writing. Moving through to the 13th century, the medieval era, well, we're definitely celebrating Christmas there. We've got that beautiful painting that we looked at before, talking about the nativity story. Still, when was the first recorded Christmas then in England? When do we start having Christmas? Well, this was the king at the time, and I bet you 50 cents you don't know who the heck that guy is. And also, what's going on here with these weird people with animal heads on? Because if we think about old Krampus with his horns, there's something a little bit Krampus-like going on at this very first Christmas celebration. We've got music, what looks to be a dance taking place, and people wearing animal heads. Most peculiar. Well, to fill in some mysteries, the year the first Christmas celebration happened in the British Isles was 1038, so the 11th century, and the king there is a chap called King Harold Harefoot. Harefoot because he was a fast runner, like a hare, right? And there he is going, oh, no, I've cropped that image. But, he was a person who was a bit of a rule giver, and he liked to set down new pieces of legislation. He was quite a serious king, really. And, of course, he was also a Christian, because Christianization is well underway at this point in time, even of the Vikings. But Christmas in 1038 was pretty weird. Let's try and peel things back to as far as we possibly can and talk about some awkward aspects of the Christmas story. Starting with this, which I hope is a familiar image and icon to everyone. This, of course, is Stonehenge, one of the most famous monuments in all the world. How long ago was Stonehenge constructed? Well, it was constructed 3,000 years BC. Now, some people use the term BCE nowadays, before Common Era, because that's considered to be more inclusive to people from other cultural backgrounds. But BC used to be the measure, and that stood for before Christ. So 3,000 years before Christ, we have Stonehenge. And Stonehenge is just one of many, many megalithic monuments around the British Isles and Brittany, just over the sea in France, which was effectively part of this Brittonic culture. So all of it was connected by sea trade routes. In fact, we find some even older tombs, barrows, and megaliths. Okay, so in the top left there, you can see New Grange. That one's over in Ireland. You've then got the Ring of Brogdar below it, which is up on the Orkney Isles, just off the coast of Scotland. And then you can see Eleanor and I there at a place called Coldrum. This is a barrow tomb just over the county border we share with Kent. It's a neighbouring county to us. It's about an hour's drive from where we live. This is large monuments surrounded by dozens of these megalithic stones inside which significant people were buried. Family members were buried, sometimes members of ruling classes. We're not entirely sure, of course, because, as discussed, no real writing from this point of time. So we have to analyze bones and grave goods to try and figure out who these people were. But what's really significant about all of these monuments, and monuments from all over this country and these islands and even over in Brittany, is they all line up with the winter solstice. You may not be familiar with the idea of the winter solstice, but we have two solstices. We have the summer solstice and the winter solstice. The summer solstice is the longest day of sunlight, and the winter solstice is its opposite, right? It's the day of longest darkness. So most sun and least sun. And ancient peoples were measuring these things, okay? And one of the things that the ancients recognized was that after the midwinter solstice, you actually had 3 days of effective darkness where it seemed like the sun did not return and begin to rise again to mark the start of the new year. And people obviously have been looking at the stars and analyzing the stars and theorizing about what's up there in the heavens for a really long time. We get all these weird signs of the zodiac. If you're into astrology, like I am, then you might recognize some of these icons. And you get weird hybrid creatures that are blending human and animal together. Things like centaurs, for example, or flying horses like the Pegasus, as well as some familiar animals like dragons in some instances, but also monkeys and snakes and crabs. And different cultures have different versions of all of these star signs and astronomical phenomena. But the important part is this midwinter celebration and the following days of darkness followed by the sun's return. Well, when does that all line up with in our modern calendar? It lines up with Christmas Day. Oh, hold on a minute. So this day was significant for a lot longer than we might recognize it is. 3,000 years before the birth of Christ, or before the Common Era. Well, that's pretty interesting. And when we look back at what life was like in that period of time, we recognize that culture was mostly animistic. What does that mean? Well, it's not explicitly to do with animals, actually, although it might sound like it. Animism is to do with the animating spirit of things, so the soul of things, okay? And people at this point in time, they did lots of very beautiful cave paintings that we've studied and analysed, and these exist in all sorts of cultures across all different continents, really. And a lot of these early cultures had some similar philosophical ideas that underpinned a lot of what they did. And you might think, how is this relevant to Krampus, Martin? You're leading us down a blind alley. But no, I'm definitely not. Because this idea of animals and humans all being part of a big system of souls and spirits that are all interconnected, as represented in these pieces of art, well, we know that in religious practice, such as it was at this point in time, people also celebrated through their shamans, their effective priests, their holy men, later on becoming perhaps druids, but certainly shamanic characters in the past. They dressed up as half animal, half human hybrids. How, you might ask? Well, to give you some examples, you can see we have a very, very ancient example in the top left there. That is an antler's skull and horns to be worn as a kind of mask by a shaman. On the right-hand side, we have a more medieval into Renaissance example that is actually a bear's head, but it's woven and then sealed. And then at the bottom left, we have something called the Dorset Ouzel, which is an example that survived through into the 19th century. The Dorset Ouzel there, very early photograph. It's quite a famous icon in English folklore studies. In fact, if you buy the sort of Bible, the old Bible, as it were, of English folklore, the Reader's Digest Guide to British Folklore, the picture that is on the front, embossed onto the cover, is actually the Dorset Ouzel. Now, this photo was taken, as I say, really early in the advent of photography. And then, believe it or not, somebody broke into the museum and stole the Ouzel's head. So now we only have reproduction versions of it. But people used to wear these things right through across time and history. And you're thinking, well, what kind of timescale are we talking about, Martin? Well, the star car antler example dates from 8,000 BC. So well in advance of Stonehenge, okay? 5,000 years beforehand, people were already engaged in these kinds of activities, pretending to be or acting as if they had blended with or melded with animals. Looking at that bear mask I was telling you about, that is a reproduction of a 14th century example, which had decayed, so they rebuilt it using all the traditional methods. Why stags? Why bears? Well, these are some of the most powerful and majestic animals that you can find in the wild in these isles. The stag, long associated with the discovery of secrets, links to the other world of fairies and mystery beyond our sight, out of which strange things happened. And we have folk tales that continue and are carried through right through Christian ages and written down by monks, in fact, which account for some of this lore. The bear, very strong example of an animal, right? Highly symbolic of strength. And you can see there's a funny little string there at the bottom. Well, that's because if you tug on that string, it actually claps the mouth closed on this bear mask. And we see a lot of later examples of this kind of thing. If you think back to the first Christmas celebration picture I showed you of those characters lined up wearing these animal heads, looking a bit Krampus adjacent, we might say. Well, these are examples of that sort of thing. Then we have the Ouzel, weirder, a horned man and animal. Well, if we think about a famous character from Christian mythology or Christian stories, a horned figure, well, we tend to associate that kind of scary horned character with the devil, right? With Satan, Lucifer. He goes by many names in Christian mythology. Still, we know that in the ancient past, people used to take sacred processions where they used to dress up, they used to walk through these monuments, passing through particular gaps in them. Often they would watch the sun rise on that morning. They would line up the sunrise with midsummer and midwinter. And one of the most fascinating things we know people used to do at this point in time is they would open up barrow tombs. Tombs, everyone's familiar with this idea. The relationship with the dead in the ancient pagan past was very different to our relationship with death today. Okay, today, if you are a Christian, you've got that concept in mind of people going to heaven. Lots of different religious traditions have lots of different beliefs about what happens after you die. What seemed to be the case with these pagan cultures, particularly in the British Isles and Brittany, is that people used to, at these big moments of celebration, open up the tombs of their ancestors and bring out the bones of their ancestors. And those bones would be part of parties and ceremonies and feasts that would happen at these key points of the year. And we know this from traces of different vegetable matter and animal matter found on these bones by clever scientists, which show once they've been that showed time and again, I should say, they've been removed from their tombs, taken to these parties, basically. Grandma or great-granddad or whoever it might be would be invited to join the feast, would take part in these big occasions, and then the bones would be packed away in the barrow again until the sunlight once again lined up on one of those special occasions with the entrance to these barrow tombs. A wild idea, but baked into that is this concept which does carry through, believe it or not, into those weird early Christmas celebrations where people believed the world turned upside down, the rules turned upside down. And if you think about that idea of the year being reborn out of darkness, you can connect to that concept of upside downiness, of things being turned around. All right? Good becoming evil, life becoming death, the man becoming the animal, all of these concepts getting blended up together. Pretty strange. If we look beyond those early Neolithic, prehistoric pagans, we can then move into classical culture, the Greco-Roman cultures. What did they do to celebrate this same midwinter juncture? Well, they had a festival called Saturnalia. You may be familiar with the planet Saturn, named after this god. Saturn is the name he's given by the Romans, but to the ancient Greeks, he was known as Kronos. Kronos. Now, that's an interesting aspect to a word. Chronology. What's that to do with? It's to do with time, of course. So the festival of Saturnalia, which took place at the end of the year, around midwinter, was this celebration of this terrifying figure, actually, Kronos or Saturn, who was associated with time. He was kind of the spirit of time. And to break that down into some details, that's how Kronos was spelt right in the middle of the screen, so different to how we would spell chronology to do with clocks today, but the word sound is the same. And Kronos, famous for having a sickle, with which he actually killed his father, but also we get this idea of sickles and reaping, the end of the year, things being sliced, harvests, of course, and that time of things closing down, of sacrifice, of the end, things being cut with that sickle, which of course we can also associate with later ideas such as the Grim Reaper and, to some aspects, death as well. Though Kronos was not, it's worth saying, a god of death to the ancient Greeks and Romans, Saturn as he was, of course, to the Romans. But he was significant for doing a few things, including being the father of the Olympian gods, or almost all of the Olympian gods, who he was really worried about usurping his power. So he ate them all. And we've got this quite dark picture by Goya there of Kronos, of Saturn, consuming his own children. The person who was accepted from this, the god who managed to escape because of his mother's cunning, was Zeus to the ancient Greeks, or Jupiter to the Romans. And Zeus, Jupiter, is replaced by a stone by his mother. Father eats the stone, feels full. He's eaten all of his children. There they are in his belly. Zeus, meanwhile, raised and becomes this powerful god, and then challenges his monstrous father. And you then get the regurgitation, the return of all of these gods and their rebirth. So Saturnalia is this strange time about rebirth and the birth of a new period of time. Strange to us, but also, if you think about it, there's probably some connections to be drawn there about this idea of gods being born at this particular juncture in the annual cycle. And if we look at how Saturnalia was celebrated, we have some pretty cool examples, one of which here comes from Lucian of Samosata in his poem Saturnalia. And you might think, why are you saying that weird, Martin? His name's Lucian, obviously. But in this point in time, they pronounce C's as hard K sounds, hence Kronos with his K. Anyway, Lucian of Samosata, in his poem Saturnalia, he describes Saturnalia in some detail, but one example he gives here. During my week, this festival, the serious is barred, so people can't be serious anymore. No business allowed. It's a holiday. Drinking and being drunk, oh, that's quite familiar with a lot of Christmas celebrations. Noise and games of dice, well, there's a lot of Monopoly matches. Probably not in ancient Rome, of course, but, still similar spirit. Families getting together, friends getting together, playing games. Appointing of kings and feasting of slaves. Going to come back to that in a minute. Singing naked. Well, I'm not sure many of us would be that into the idea of getting naked. Certainly in Britain at Christmas, it's quite chilly at that time of year. Imagine very similar in New England and a lot of parts of America. But still, the Romans and the Greeks, they did like to get naked at special occasions. Clapping, so we're having a lovely time. An occasional ducking of corked faces in icy water. So corked from drinking, right? So drunk faces being dunked in icy water, playing of games, bits of mischief, such are the functions over which I preside. Now, this is Saturnalia, the god speaking of his own festival through the mouth of this poet. So it's a jolly time, but it is a time of things, once again, being turned on their head. What do I mean by that? Well, if we focus in on that phrase, the appointing of kings and feasting of slaves. Was it normal for slaves to feast? I mean, we're all probably familiar with slavery even in the modern day. Within the American context, we have concepts of slavery, of course. The Roman entire empire was built on slavery, as were the Vikings and lots of other imperial cultures too. Why would the slaves be feasting at Saturnalia? And why would kings be being appointed at Saturnalia? Well, this is because we have this very strange tradition where at Christmas, from the Romans onwards, those of high status would serve those of low status. Roles were reversed, and slaves were elevated during Saturnalia to be the ones who feasted, the waiters in that time becoming their masters. A wild concept, you might think, and yet it is one that is continued through several European cultures, particularly British culture, through the medieval era. In terms of what's happening in Britain, though, returning to Bede, after the Romans have left the country, where, of course, some of those cultural memories and some of those cultural practices that the Romans brought with them, they are going to be carried through, aren't they? Naturally, you're going to hang on to some of these good ideas. Maybe not the singing naked part, but some of the other stuff. Playing games, having a nice drink, well, that's similar to what our pagan ancestors have been doing anyway. We're still doing bits of that. Why don't we elaborate it? So they did. They carried on with those ideas through Bede's time. But what we learn from Bede is about this other festival called Yule. Now, to try and put Yule in context, from the 8th to the 11th centuries, we had this massive invasion of Vikings coming to Britain. And you can see from where they came there, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, they were coming by sea. And rather than just raiding England and Scotland and Ireland and Wales, which they had been doing for a very long time, they decided, well, rather than just coming every summer and kidnapping a load of slaves and selling them on to, even into the Far East, some slaves that were captured by the Vikings were sold on. We're going to set up communities. We're going to claim territory. And so what you end up with in Britain is this strange cultural split which starts to develop, where you have Viking parts of previously Anglo-Saxon, pagan, Brittonic kingdoms. And one example of this is known as the Dane law. You can see it right there, that word. The Danes, coming from Denmark, they established this basic kingdom where everybody who's not within the Dane law just has to pay tax, called Danegeld, money, to not be attacked by the Vikings, to not be invaded. So effectively, England is kind of being held hostage by the Vikings at this point in time. But the Vikings, they come with their own traditions about how you mark this midsummer festival. Harold Harefoot, believe it or not, he is one of those Viking kings. Plus, in terms of the belief system that his ancestors have got and established that is part of the cultural mix that the Vikings bring, is beliefs around this guy. You can see his name written there in slightly wibbly-wobbly writing, Odin. He is the kind of Zeus equivalent, the big thunder god. We can also associate Jove with this concept, right? The god that sits up high and strikes people down with lightning. Okay, it's a very common idea in Bronze and Iron Age deities and belief systems that God has the power of lightning and lives in the sky and is up there above us. It's a truly ancient concept. But Odin, he's quite a peculiar character, actually, when you start to dig under the bonnet. He's known as the All-Father, so the father of all gods. And Yule is really important for Odin. Odin, it's worth saying, was also crucified. He chose to be in order to gain and acquire wisdom. And part of his crucifixion involved him sacrificing one of his eyes to, with the remaining eye, be able to see the past, present, and future, and to become a kind of all-seeing God. And part of the benefit he got in the deal was 2 ravens. You can see them there sat in this very early art on his shoulders. These are Hugin and Munin, whose names in translation mean thought and desire. And he used to send these ravens all around the world, gathering information for him and passing prophecies to the human world. When you saw a raven, it was thought to be an auspicious and significant time. In fact, when we see the first references to Yule, they're actually as Hugin's Yule, and that is how Yule was pronounced and spelt by the Vikings. We can see Yule as a word that means feast. So Hugin's feast, right? The feast of thought. It's time for thinking, but it's also a time for partying. And it's also known quite happily as the Raven's Feast. And I love a raven. Eleanor also loves a raven. As the Three Ravens podcast, we're very happy that the idea was that at Christmas time we had the Raven's Feast. Hooray! In terms of what happened at Yule, why was it associated with Odin? What's significant about it? Well, during the dark months of the year, following what we might recognize as the autumnal equinox, because you've got the solstices, and then between them, the equinoxes, the points of equal night, equinox, where rather than having the shortest day and longest day, you have equal. So we have a spring equinox and an autumn equinox. From the autumn equinox onwards, people started to notice storms in the sky. It was darker out. The sky got darker and darker and darker, became a stormier and stormier season. And particularly in Northern Europe, you would see something called the Northern Lights, the Aurora Borealis, as we call it today. That's a Latin term for it, but effectively shining in the sky. Mysterious stuff happening up there in the realms of the gods. And people called this the Wild Hunt. What was the Wild Hunt? Well, led by Odin, all of the fallen gods, every single last one, all of these ancient pagan deities rode amongst those storms, in the aurora borealis, capturing lost souls, welcoming fallen gods, hunting and having fun. It was a kind of a big brawl and party. So this was a period of time where gods were in the sky, and not just the recognizable ones from the Norse tradition like Odin, but all sorts of half human, half animal hybrid gods as well from previous cultures conquered by the Vikings. So, in terms of the specifics of Yule celebrations, which are the real precursor to Christmas, it's first recorded in the 5th century, so the 400s. Bede, as I mentioned, does write about it. We get quite a lot of detail from Bede about what goes into Yule. It followed the blood month in the Viking calendar, which was November. If you imagine October, harvest month, it's the time where you gather in all your crops, you harvest all your fruit. That's the point where you fill the stores. Then during November, you don't want to feed your animals through the winter months, so you slaughter them all, hence blood month. Then you move into this final month of the year when we have Yule, and that is a time of celebration and feasting through the dark while there's these scary wild hunts happening in the sky outside. And in terms of the specifics of Yule, it was known to be a 12-day festival. Well, that's quite significant if you think about Christmas. Hopefully some of you are going, of course, 12 days of Christmas. Midwinter itself, interestingly, was known as Mother's Night within this broader festival. It is the time when the new year is born. All mothers are celebrated as creators of these new things, these new lives, these new timelines almost. And Mother's Night is Midwinter Night. We also learn through Bede's writing and writings elsewhere of Yule beings. What is a Yule being? It is an example of a person dressed not entirely as a human, but wearing aspects that might make them seem monstrous to us, but that blend ideas of old pagan gods and animal worship together for fun and games, dancing, and also ritual celebration. Once again, though, Yule, as per the Romans and the Greeks, and to a certain extent, from what we know from bringing the bones of the dead out into the world of the living at midwinter, it's a time where the world is turned upside down. The servants are served by the masters. Status is reversed. Okay? And Yuletide, as it was known, then becomes Christmastide during the 11th century, during this period of time where increasingly Anglo-Saxon Vikings are becoming Christianized. What do we mean by this upside down time? Well, I love this picture on the left-hand side. You can see in it a series of things being upside down. We've got a man who's wearing his clothes upside down. So his boots are on his hands, his trousers there, or pants, I guess, as you'd say in America. He's wearing those on his top half. He's got his shirt on the bottom with his gloves on his feet. And then what else is happening? Well, we've got candles upside down. We've got a castle or a church upside down in the background. We have fish and eels swimming in the sky. We have at the bottom rats chasing cats and hares or rabbits chasing dogs. And I think most amusingly of all, we have, rather than the horse leading the cart, we've got the cart leading the horse. And we have here, rather than the man wheeling his barrow, the barrow is wheeling the man. Everything's going mad because it's Christmastide. And once again, to bring us back to that idea, we have the strange wearing of masks, animal masks, costumes, dancing, music, the ringing of bells, which is also part of wishing away bad spirits. The ringing of bells was believed to scare off ghosts and bad things. We can see masks, we can see animal-human hybrids, we can see song and dance and merriment. Now, in terms of another key figure who emerges during this period of time, he's been around a little bit beforehand. he's increasingly around afterwards. We get this character of the Green Knight. Some of you might be familiar with the 14th century poem Gawain and the Green Knight. We have an illustration of it there on the side of the screen. It's an Arthurian story, a myth of the court of King Arthur. And the Green Knight is this strange, giant figure. He's very, very old, covered in aspects of nature and much grandeur. He's very much associated with green, which of course we associate not only with wealth, but with vitality. Okay, and this old knight, he appears at King Arthur's court when? During Christmas tide, and he challenges the knights there to a duel. And Gawain beheads him at this duel at Christmas tide. And yet, he picks up his head and says, next year, Gawain, you need to come and find me, and I will do to you as you have just done to me. I suppose the head should be over here talking, but nonetheless, that's the setup for the story. It's a really interesting and strange one. But the point is, even though he's dead, he still lives. Why? Well, nature here is not dying, it's being reborn. Right? It comes to an end, it begins again. We've got weird concepts going on, upside downiness, and also what's happening with nature. It's being distorted and disrupted. Why does the Green Knight matter? Well, we have a lot of figures that evoke this concept of the Green Knight. He might be appearing in a 14th century poem, but you can see there a Greco-Roman mosaic of this horned deity. Look below it, you can see a sculpture from one of our cathedrals, Salisbury, very beautiful, ancient cathedral, one of the oldest in the country. And there is this incredible stonework of this man where nature is bursting out of his mouth. He is what we call a green man or a foliate head. You've got another example of a bronze sculpture made. It's a kind of engraving piece. By bashing bronze, they create this picture right in the center, this nature god, this nature spirit. Below that, a more modern pagan rendering of this idea of an ebb and flow between two particular figures in modern paganism. We have the Oak King and the Holly King. Who are these characters? Well, they are foliate figures, nature spirits, nature gods. The Oak King rules over the bright months. The Holly King rules over the dark months. And they are said to be aspects of the same character, where one kills the other and is reborn in this endless cycle of nature and time. I'm not saying all of these ideas are necessarily wholly connected, but they're all in the mix of what people are thinking about in terms of these green knights, these green gods, these nature spirits at the time. And in the final example, we have an illustration that accompanied A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. And a lot of people don't realize that Christmas had actually been very much out of fashion in Britain as a festival until really the publishing of The Christmas Carol, which repopularized Christmas in a major way. And if you've read the book or seen any of the film adaptations, you might be familiar with that spirit, with his crown of holly. He's in these green robes trimmed with ermine, and he's surrounded by food and drink and gifts and presents. This is the ghost of Christmas present in that book. And all of these characters, from the Green Knight or even pre-Green Knight medieval concepts, right back to the classical world, running through the Christian faith into modern paganism, you find this idea of this character. Who is he? He's a bearded god. Can we associate him with previous characters we might have encountered? Now, if we look at Christmas, this is what it used to look like. Chaos, bedlam, people having fun, no work, drinking, game playing. You can see a corpse sat in a chair there being wheeled around. This is happening in the medieval era. You can see a Tricelesque in the background there on the wall. That is a Trinity symbol, associated, of course, the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, but also with various ancient pagan beliefs. Okay, it's a much older symbol than the Christian one, and yet still appeared in Christian and cathedral contexts in Britain. Lots of bedlam, lots of having fun. And this chap here on the right-hand side, he is even wearing animal ears on his silly hat. And he's got some bread there. He's clearly had quite a lot to drink. There's a dog loose. Everyone's having a very merry time. Christmas is a raucous time in the medieval era. It disappears after our Civil War, the English Civil War, where Christmas is actually cancelled by the government. You are not allowed to celebrate it anymore. And it slowly but surely comes back after the English Revolution and the restoration of the monarchy through to Dickens, who really puts the capstone on that and brings Christmas back in a really big way. But the concepts of Christmas, underpinning them in the medieval era, believe it or not, from all of that bedlam, are famously some key Christian ideas: love, charity, goodwill, friendship, hospitality, mirth, all of these ideas of kindness and giving. Talked a bit about things being reversed, upside down time. Well, it is that time where people stopped being brutal and murdering one another or trying to cheat one another, trying to get away with breaking the rules. It was a time where actually everybody tried to be kind. Families came together, whole communities came together, and statuses were reversed. And it was a reminder that actually you ought to be humble. One of the big lessons of Christ, of course, right, is that you should give up. Turn the other cheek. What you have should be given away in charity. A lot of these key messages are baked into medieval Christmas. It then becomes this raucous festival. It starts off with good intentions. There are lots of people who still celebrate it in that way. But we also get this figure beginning to appear as we transition from pagan Yule into Christmas. In particular, we have a goat-riding, bearded man, lots of foliage on his head. He's holding what's known as a wassail bowl. Wassail is a kind of song, a happy, joyful song, or a greeting that people would give to one another around Christmas time or Yule time. The singing of songs and the kind of worship of one another is the idea of the wassail. But who does that represent? Goat riding, deity associated with nature and paganism as we move into a Christian era. Well, it's generally agreed it's Odin. The origins of Father Christmas, as he's known in this country, is believed to be Odin, a combination of this green man, this green knight, this nature spirit. But what you'll notice is in the earlier version, the black and white version, we have this concept of the wassail bowl being given to others, the sharing of things, the community, everybody drinking from the same bowl, which is shared. As we move into a later concept of Father Christmas, he becomes a gift-giving deity. And that, strangely, wasn't actually part of Christmas celebration. The idea of giving gifts doesn't come to Britain until later on. Where does that come from then? Because we also know that Father Christmas wasn't always dressed in red in this country. Very often, in fact, he was dressed in green. Some people say, oh, the Coca-Cola company are the reason that Santa Claus wears red capes and clothes. That's not really the case. He was shown in both green and red costumes for a very, very long time beforehand. Sometimes he's described as having a red lining and a green outside to his cloak. Sometimes he's described as having a red outline and a green undercloak. But these ideas of red and green, why are they significant symbolically? Red was blood, sacrifice, of course, warmth and love as well, but it's a time of year following Blood Month and these crazy pagan sacrifices that are made where you're slaughtering all of your animals and hoping that the gods are going to bring you another good harvest next year or a good field full of sheep or cows or pigs or whatever it might be. Green nature, right? The return of life. So this is Father Christmas in his basic form, emerging during the medieval era. We then, though, end up in this weird place where in England we have Father Christmas is the name we tend to know him by, much more than Santa Claus or Santa Claus as he was before. And Santa Claus is a more European concept. And of course, in America, you're a melting pot culture. You take bits of both and all sorts of different aspects of different cultures and bring them to America when people emigrate there. But actually, these are two very different figures. One of them is ancient, linked to pagan gods. This other guy, Santa Claus, where does he come from? Because just to recap, Father Christmas, he's this kind of pagan symbol of reversal of things going upside down, of a king, a god even, serving food and drink to the servants, to the poor. He rules over those 12 nights of Yule or Christmastide. We might be familiar with the Shakespeare play, Twelfth Night, right? Taking place during the same period, the 12 days of Christmas. Familiar song to lots of people. It's a time of charity, it's a time of feasting, but it's also a celebration of the return of nature after midwinter, of the sun rising again. That sun, that light, that life-giving force, God returning, Christ is born. That's the symbolism. Santa Claus, well, we know exactly who he was. Saint Nicholas, a lot of people call him Old Saint Nick. St. Nicholas of Myra. Myra is in Turkey, in southern Europe. He was a 4th century secret gift-giving saint. What do I mean by that? A secret gift-giving saint? Well, there's lots of stories associated with St. Nicholas, but one of the sort of representative ones of his secret gift-giving, he learns of 3 daughters of a merchant. This merchant can't let his daughters go free. He wants a good dowry price for them, a bride price. He wants a husband to pay for them to marry these daughters of his. No one is willing to. And so this father is going to sell his sisters out, or sell his daughters out, sorry, I should say, for sex work. Shocking, awful. So St. Nicholas, through charity, collects money to pass secretly to these daughters by dropping through their window the sums of money needed for them to buy their own freedom, to pay their own bride prices to their father. Amazing story, amazing act of charity and kindness, but he grants these women freedom, they become Christians and acolytes of his, and they follow him in his mission. Now, the earliest life, as in the life story, the biography of St. Nicholas, was actually written in the 9th century. And as with a lot of saints, there is a little bit of doubt as to whether St. Nicholas of Myra ever really existed, or if he's just a really great idea, a great concept, a person to ascribe stories to. These things are matters of faith, and something that anyone who says they know for sure, well, I feel like you should feel a little bit skeptical and doubtful. But the point is, his saint's day, the day he was celebrated in the calendar, was the 6th of December, Holy Innocents' Day, the day of Holy Innocents, where you are celebrating children, innocent children, often children who died or been lost, sacrificed, but still, Holy Innocents' Day is St. Nicholas's day. And this is related to a very strange story to do with St. Nicholas, where he learns of a man who's been butchering children and selling their meat as pork. So he's been killing these kids and pickling these babies and then selling their meat on. And St. Nicholas learns of this, goes to the butcher's house when he's not there, prays to God over this pickling barrel, and the children come back together, are reformed and reborn and brought back to life by the power of God. In the 17th century, this weird thing happens. This is the 1600s. He is known as Sinterklaas for the first time. And you can see him there reviving those pickled children, bringing them back from the dead. But he becomes, at this point in time, during his feast day, Holy Innocents' Day, it becomes customary to give gifts to children. So that's the first time, really, we get this concept of Santa Claus giving gifts. That is in the 1600s. And it really happens in the Netherlands first, so the Dutch countries. The Netherlands, of course, very powerful empire during this period of time. One of the great seafaring nations, great traders, great scientists, great painters, amazing painters during the Dutch Golden Age, as it was known. Anyway, so that's where we get Santa. That's his first time appearing. Then, in the 19th century, the 1800s, we get this really weird other thing emerging. You can see this figure alongside Santa Claus. Santa Claus, in the tradition of Northern European, Dutch countries, those around them, Santa is arriving riding a white horse. The reindeer aren't part of the mix at that point in time, but he has a little assistant who joins him. And this assistant is known as Black Peter. And you can see in one image, Black Peter said he's made black by going down the chimney and being covered in soot. But of course, the Dutch famous slave owners as well. And so there is an association between slavery as well as the soot aspect of this character, Black Peter, as he's known. The other image then shows Santa and Black Peter working together to go down this list of naughty children and nice children. They're building toys, they're planning out what's going to happen, because the good children will be visited by Santa Claus and given a gift. The naughty children, Black Peter will take care of, and he will give them a lump of coal instead. And that is the origins of that idea. It happens in the 1800s, so surprisingly late. And Zwart Peter, or Black Peter, in the modern day, has a lot of quite negative associations for people in Europe. He's not a popular figure with many people in the Netherlands. These are Black Lives Matters protesters who are kicking off about the fact that this character is still part of the tradition in some countries. They think that he should be done away with or changed. Not only that, but can you see even there in his hand, he's holding what looks like some vegetable material. What's that fibrous matter? Well, it's a switch. Because in addition to giving naughty children a lump of coal, he might also capture them in his sack. You can see a little face there poking out because it's been picked up by a sack and whisked away. But also, they might be beaten with this switch. So there is a reward for being a good child and a very serious punishment, a quite terrifying punishment from being a bad child. Okay? And that morality only really emerges quite late on. This leads us to Krampus. Here he is. We talked about some key features of him earlier on. We've got his chains. He carries them around and rattles them, but is not a slave himself, it seems. There's no indication that Krampus is enslaved. He seems to do what he does because he enjoys it. And he, like Black Peter, is a friend to Santa Claus. He has his horns. He has his long tongue. He also has his switch for beating children and punishing them. But you'll notice that barrel in the image on the right-hand side, it's a sack, just like Black Peter. But in most instances, it's a barrel. It's a kind of coal scuttle in which he will pick up naughty children and run them around and terrorize them. Okay? In terms of where he comes from, he is an Alpine, so around the Alpine countries, primarily a German or Germanic tradition. He first emerges earlier than Black Peter. He dates from the 17th century. So it would seem like Krampus came first, and after that, the idea of Black Peter was created. Okay, so he's the original, it seems to us. Like Black Peter, though, he accompanies Santa Claus on Holy Innocents' Day, which in the modern time has become known as Krampusnacht, the night of Krampus. It's the night when Krampus is out. And most significantly, like Black Peter, he punishes bad behavior. He's there to be a kind of moral arbiter. We see him here in a quite funny greetings card. This is the equivalent of a Christmas card from the 19th century, where there's a whole load of naughty children who've been whisked away on this switch. One very defiant baby there with his arms crossed, saying, well, I'm naughty, but hey, at least I'm enjoying flying through the sky over the German countryside. But looking at him there, he's very clearly a devilish character, isn't he? He looks really similar to the devil. And in terms of the narrative, to be really clear, from his earliest appearances, he has been a companion of St. Nicholas. He goes with him as a friend to these places. And while St. Nicholas is a goody, giving out these gifts, knocking door to door on households, giving out presents to good kids, behind him comes Krampus with the switch and the barrel to whip the children, and if they're naughty, put them into the coal scuttle and run them around. He will rattle his chains. He's a scary character. And of course, when we think about those kinds of half animal, half human hybrids from pagan cultures, this kind of terrifying figure isn't exactly new. Yet what is important about Krampus really is this idea that in Germanic cultures around the Alpine region, spreading through to the Netherlands and around as well, slightly into France where they have variations, Christmas has a dark side. For the light of Santa Claus, who is very much a Christian character, you then have this shadowy, dark other. The other part of Christmas, almost the shadow cast by the light of Christmas and the joy and the twinkle of it. And it's worth remembering, of course, the Germans, they have Christmas trees with decorations on long before the British do. The English don't figure that out until Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, who was a German, brings the tradition during the 19th century to England. Around the same time, Charles Dickens releases The Christmas Carol, which is pretty much the best-selling book of that era, with the possible exception of Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was, I believe, overall globally, the most successful novel of the 19th century. Yet, let's not forget those ancient druids and those staghorns, or those ancient shamans at the very least. And then the Oozer as well, continuing through. It's not as if, although Krampus is a bit of a peculiar Germanic tradition, that in other places, going back a long time and enduring even beyond and into the modern era, we're not seeing these same kinds of traditional costumes involving animal-human hybrids, the wearing of horns, and probably some quite terrifying parties. And we can link a lot of this back to Odin as well, our Father Christmas character, who, if we look at his crown, we can also find within that a kind of devilish aspect. In fact, Odin, the All-Father, as a pagan god, was not adapted by Christians. He was seen as a representative of sin, paganism. His monuments were destroyed. Aspects of Odin worship and Norse worship done away with systematically across centuries in the British Isles and beyond. Mummers plays are a really important idea in all this. And the tradition of mummers plays goes back to our very earliest writings in this country and continues through even to today. These are traditional Christmas and Yuletide celebrations where people would dress up as half animal, half human hybrids, and they would engage in dances. They would take part in plays. They would play songs. And we get an example here of a very early photograph of what's known as a hobby horse with snapping jaws. Horses, of course, being fertility symbols. Hobby horses were led around churches. They were thought to bless places. In Wales, we get a variation of this called the Marithwyd, which is a horse's skull you can see up there. Worn again, though, in a kind of simple sheet. These are costumes that people were familiar with. In Mummers plays, people would play famous iconic characters. They would replay Bible scenes. They would sing rowdy old folk songs, as well as telling Bible stories and morality tales. David and Goliath, St. George slaying the dragons, a very famous one in Britain. But they happened up and down, particularly the central corridor of England, and involved this kind of ceremonial dress. And in terms of the Oozer, specifically, where does his name come from? Well, it comes from the worst one, the devil, which in a Somerset or West Country dialect becomes, rather than the worst one, the Wurzen, Wurzer, Oozer. The worst one, the devil, there he is. He is a person people are dressing up as at Christmas time. They're engaging in these mummers plays, and they're also parading around in their communities. These parades, I mentioned before, wassails. You would go around to different people's houses, you would sing them songs and put on little plays and performances for them in costume, collecting money for charity. You can see an example there with the Grim Reaper, a fertility goddess, carrying green shoots. You have an old king, you have the devil there with a pitchfork, and you have some soldiers. People are dressed up nicely, going wassailing. Bottom left-hand corner, you have some examples of guisers. Guising may not be a word you're familiar with, but it's a disguise. You're disguising yourself. You're looking like something different. We might associate this particularly with Halloween and Samhain, as the pagans call it. These young boys here, in some of the earliest photographs ever taken in Scotland, are actually wearing vegetable gourds cut into masks. So these are turnip faces that they're wearing. And they would go around and perform pranks, collect coins, treats, All Hallows cakes, sometimes also known as Souls cakes. We have some modern pagans here. They are from the island of Shetland, dressed as what are known as straw bears, straw figures. Another straw bear example there from Europe, carrying a stick. These are a bit like trolls, wild spirits. People would dress in this kind of fertility wear, play songs, parade, collect money for charity, do all sorts of fun mumming. But you were dressing in a disguise, you were guising, you were singing songs and celebrating other people, sharing charity, sharing drink, sharing food and song. You were wassailing. These ideas are all wrapped up with Christmas and Yule, but that season really starting from the autumn equinox, the end of harvest, lasting through until the new year. And we also find this tradition in what are known as carols, spelt like that. Funny spelling, you might say. Well, they are. Carols are line dances and circle dances. So people holding hands either in a long line, a bit like a conga, you might say, but long lines, sometimes snaking around an entire community, dancing together and singing together, sometimes holding hands, perhaps around with one another, everyone in the community, around a church, to link everyone together, to bless that church. And that kind of thing also used to happen, we believe, at ancient pagan sites. And that used to happen at New Year's, other celebrations, but these dances were known as carols. And this joining together to sing songs and parade is where we get the root of the Christmas carol, the term Christmas carol. Christmas dance, well, we lost the dance part, we kept the songs, and we end up with Christmas carols. And a lot of our earliest songs in Britain and British folk music are actually Christmas carols. And you can see, as I was talking about, a Georgian Christmas there in the middle. By that time, people have lost, apart from in the countryside and wilder places, they've lost that habit of wearing animal costumes and cavorting all together and mumming. They become a bit more respectable, but they are still singing Christmas carols. They are still playing music and visiting the rich to collect money. And this has a real boom and revival in the 19th century with that kind of traditional idea of a Victorian Christmas, Charles Dickens, and so on and so forth, leading into today. Which brings us back to these ideas once more, doesn't it? The Annunciation, the census in Bethlehem, the shepherds and kings, the Nativity. When did all of this get formalized? Well, it wasn't all at once. Actually, these different ideas snapped into the calendar across a series of different reforms that took place over hundreds of years, centuries. We recognize them all now, but in the past only fragments of this, a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, would be recognized. The Julian calendar, for perspective, was replaced by the Gregorian calendar. These are two different calendar systems in 1582. So that's when we get the days of the year as we recognize them. The Gregorian calendar, 1582, that's initiated. England, though, was very late to adopt it. We didn't adopt it in this country until 1752. And that, obviously, in relation to America and America's independence, puts things in perspective when we started to actually even get 12 months in the year with the number of days and leap years and so on and so forth that we would recognize. Even the placement of Christmas. The fact that Annunciation happens on the 25th of March, 9 months before, as I mentioned earlier, well, that idea is not actually as ancient as people might believe it to be. And so if we take all of this in the round and think about it, St. Bede helps us an enormous amount. He begins to explain where we've been and where we're going to a little bit. This upside down time, where we get characters like the Lord of Misrule, the person in the community appointed to make fun of the powerful and to bring them down to size. We get the masters serving servants. We get the continuation of the wearing of animal-type disguises, dating back to times we can't even really imagine the span of, leading through to characters like Krampus appearing in Europe, but also mummers' plays still enduring in parts of the countryside, even in spite of the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment and having a big revival at the end of the 19th century. Do we need this morality figure to whip us and torture us, or our children, put them in a coal barrel or coal scuttle on their back and run them around, terrifying them to remind them of right and wrong and whether they've been good or bad? I feel like that's a question for each individual family. But when it comes to the morality of Christmas and whether we are punished for bad deeds on Christmas, I think if we look at that man again, holding his alcohol and drinking his sweet treats, dancing his merry dance while wearing his silly hat, I think we all know that in the morning after that, he's going to be feeling as if he's really set up his own punishment in a way as the old year ends and the new year sets about its beginning. And so there we are. That is the weird history of Christmas, Krampus's place within it, but hopefully you found that interesting.